And today's guest is Robbie Swale, a leadership coach, author, and podcaster who's focusing on creativity, coaching, and leading with honour. Hi, Robbie. Thanks for joining us today. Where are you calling from?
Thanks, Ian. Great to be here. I'm in our new house. We're just moving from southwest London, where I've lived for the last kind of 8 years, to the Worcestershire-Warwickshire border. So we're I'm in a tiny little kind of, what do you call it, hamlet? I don't know, called Pitch Hill, just near Evesham and near Stratford-upon-Avon.
It does looks like a nice house.
Yeah, I've got a good background, haven't I, with some like beams and bricks. Yeah.
Cool. Right, I'll come on to your background in a moment, but to get straight to the inspiration, can you tell us a person that inspires you the most and why?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, I don't know if everybody kind of says this, I feel like there are so many people that have inspired me. It's hard to, it would be hard to get it down to even 5. But one of the people that often comes to mind when I think about who inspires me is a British novelist called David Gemmell.
Okay.
And he wrote kind of essentially fantasy novels, but a mixture of fantasy and historical stuff between the mid-80s and when he died in 2006, I think. And I picked these books up a bit by chance when I was about 14. And I'm so glad I did, because like a lot of fantasy novels, I mean, like most novels, but a lot of fantasy novels particularly, they're really stories about, teaching us about humanity. And I really feel like David Gemmell did that in lots of ways. And more recently, like you just said, my work focuses quite a bit on creativity. And a really interesting thing happened in David Gemmell's life. So he worked as a journalist, and then and various other things, but a big chunk of time as a journalist. And then he was diagnosed with cancer, and that finally got him to write his first novel.
Right.
Except that it was a misdiagnosis. So he never actually had, at that time, he didn't actually have cancer, but it was this great sign of like this thing that he'd really wanted to do, I imagine, for a long time. And it took, really, really difficult situation in life for him to be like, no, now's the time to write the book. And that was the first David Gemmell book that I read. It's the first one that most people read. I wouldn't say it's necessarily his best, because it has all those things that first novels often do, like he's still learning his craft and that kind of thing. But it's a great book called Legend.
Okay. Yeah. And I saw there's a website, The Wisdom of Gemmell. Is that you have something to do with that? Is that?
Yeah, so one of my I do, yeah. So and it's a funny part of, like, I think if you'd asked me that question, I don't know, 5, 6, 7, 10 years ago, I might have been a bit embarrassed to say that David Gemmell was such a big inspiration. I'm not sure. I certainly would have been at one point. I wouldn't have talked about it. Didn't feel cool. And if you do, and even if you do the work that I do, then, shouldn't I be saying, one of the inspirational, I don't know, coaches or thought leaders that everyone says? I kind of have those stories. But a really important moment for me was, I'd had this idea for a David Gemmell website, partly inspired by realizing how much he had influenced me. Yep. So realizing, like, I kind of had this thought about I was a bit worried that I'd been too influenced by I'm a Manchester United fan, and I was too influenced by watching Sir Alex Ferguson on Match of the Day, who famously doesn't stay in the successes he's had very long. Like, he was always thinking about the next year, the next season. And I realized I was a bit like that. And I was like, there's lots of things about Alex Ferguson that are great things to be inspired by, a really amazing leader in lots of ways, very incredibly successful. But I was like, who else have I kind of really been influenced by other than my family? And I realized I'd read David Gemmell's books all 3 times by the age of 20 or whatever. So they were really in me. And in them is this kind of lots of like philosophy, really, about what it means to be human, and particularly what it means to be a man. Ideas about honor, ideas about doing the right thing, these things that really mattered to me, and ideas about fear and courage. And I had this idea to make a website which pulled together all those inspirational quotes and ideas from his book, but I didn't do it for a long time. And I had a load of these things that I wanted to do and didn't do. And a big moment for me was finally getting through all that procrastination and resistance and launching that website, The Wisdom of David Gemmell, which is at wisdomofgemmell.com. And it has, and now it's been there for, like, what are we on? Must be 7 years or something. And I
Yeah.
do, and and you can, so people can get emailed a David Gemmell quote every week if they want to sign up. And there's a whole database of them now on the website, and a Twitter account and all kinds of things.
Brilliant.
And now I'm kind of
well
proud
done.
to talk about it as well, which is like fun because that shows how I've grown.
Yeah, and it's inspiring to think, I not heard of him, maybe I don't read it enough, but to think, who has inspired me, who may not be that crazy well known, and could I do something like that? It's totally a brilliant idea. Thanks. So a tiny bit more on your background now. So you earlier on in your career, you were in arts and culture as a venue manager, and then you had some time in training and leadership and career development, but more recently, it's still maybe quite a few years ago, you created this 12-minute method, which has led into your work as a writer, a coach, and various associate things you've got going on. Now, the 12-minute method is quite significant, and maybe I'm going to ask you in a moment about that, but essentially you were stuck in creative hell, procrastinating and not doing a lot of things that you wanted to do, I think, and you wouldn't put your face out there on social media. So you started writing on your 12-minute train journey every morning, a little 12-minute blog, which over a number of months and years has become this 12-minute method. So could you tell us a bit more about what has inspired you along this whole journey?
Yeah, of course. And I mean, you've said some of it there, Iain, but the David Gemmell story is part of that, because it's like there were these things that I wanted to do and I didn't do for a long time. And there were some others that never got done. There was a book idea and a business idea that I just like had too much doubt and worry and just let them drift away. And then rather heartbreaking, somebody else did them. You kind of find you find the book on a bookshelf, or someone introduced me once to the people who had this business. I had a kind of football pub watching business idea, which I never did anything about. And then someone once introduced me to the person who had basically done that idea. So it was a good idea and I hadn't done it. It was kind of gutting to be introduced to that person. And so, yeah, about 6 and a bit years ago, so August 2016, I was, like you said, really that feeling of creative hell, which I didn't kind of know about at the time, but I imagine lots of people can identify with, the feeling of like really wanting to do something, but finding myself wrapped up in all kinds of doubt and worry. And I would have this, and I have had this in my life with, like I say, a book idea, business ideas, asking people out, everything from creative hell in the broadest sense. Like anytime we want to do something courageous that makes something happen for us in our life, one of the places if I want to really remember what it feels like, I kind of take myself back to this party I was at once where there was a karaoke machine and I really wanted to sing, and I just like the whole party I wanted to do it, but I didn't really, because I was terrified. And I'm not that, I'm a very average singer. I can hold a tune but not much more. And I didn't do it. The whole, you're there for like hours and not feeling able to step up and do that thing. And so that when I want to remember what it feels like, I remember that. And part of the reason I need to remember what it feels like is I accidentally did this thing which has changed me so that I don't feel that nearly as much anymore. Okay. So back in 2016, me and Joel, my coach, were talking about this thing that filled me with all this creative hell and anxiety. And it was like posting anything online, really. It wasn't that I wasn't there online. I probably had a website for my coaching business by that point. I had definitely had phases where I would happily post things on Facebook or whatever, and it would just kind of, some of it would just ping off. But at this point, I really didn't. And so we designed an experiment to help me get through this procrastination. And it was exactly like you say. It was to get on the train, the train journey was about 12 minutes, right while the train's moving, stop when it stops, proofread it once, post it on LinkedIn. And that was because I thought no one read LinkedIn. And also because it would be a bit safer, and also because it was a kind of nicer place, still is really, I think, kind of nicer, more supportive place than Facebook, say. And so I did that, and it wasn't fun. And I had a lot of that feeling of kind of anxiety, but I could feel that it was good for me. Like it was the right thing to do on some level, even though it was hard. Yeah, I think a lot of people will kind of identify with that, you know, maybe with exercise. It's like, I never want to go for a run. That's not quite true. I do now a bit, but for a long time I didn't. And but the feeling, and it can feel painful and a bit boring. And then you get back and it's like, oh, that was a good thing for me to do. And you feel it, I feel it for the rest of the day. So I decided to make it into a weekly practice, this blogging. I would do it once a week until Christmas. And then at Christmas 2016, I decided to keep it going. And I've been now doing it for 6 years or so. And I stopped getting the train for various reasons, or getting it as much. So I now set a timer for 12 minutes. And then a couple of things just came out of that are just worth saying. You know, one is about 3 years in, I realized I'd written 80,000 words.
Wow.
12 minutes at a time. That's what 12 minutes a week of writing for 3 years is, 80,000 words. And I realized that would be enough for a book. And actually, in the end, I realized it was too much for a book. It was actually, you know, it should be better off as being 4 books. But at the time I thought it would be enough for a book. And I was going to call it, I wrote this book in 12 minutes, because I thought that was kind of funny. Yeah. And then my friend Steve, who was going to work on it, editing it with me, he said, well, that's a great title, because it's kind of makes me think, if you wrote a book in 12 minutes, I should probably get on doing that thing that I've been meaning to do. But can the book help people with that as well? And then the kind of second miraculous thing, the first miraculous thing is 80,000 words. And the second is, it turned out I had written 80,000 words about something, because I'd just been writing about what I was interested in. And what I was interested in was all this struggle that I was going through, and also the coaching work I was doing, which is really helping people do the things they want to do, they're not doing. That's a good definition for coaching in some ways. Yes. I had been writing about that the whole time. And so when I sat down and thought about what it takes to do something that you want to do and aren't doing, these pieces, they fitted into those parts. And those parts are now the 4 books in the 12-minute method series, and 3 of which are out, and 1 of which will come out by the end of the year. So that's there, Iain, is some kind of potted, shortish description of the 12-minute
brilliant
method.
Story. And the 4 steps are: get started, number 1. Number 2, keep going. Number 3, create the conditions for great work. And number 4, share. So yeah, I just wanted to make sure I mentioned them, because they're quite powerful.
Yeah, and it's worth saying though, Iain, that like I'm now regretting slightly that like there's a really tricky thing about the create the conditions one.
Okay.
Like, because it comes third in that list, and it kind of felt to me like it should, because share should come last. You know, because that's like in a way that's the end of when you've made this podcast episode. In the end, in a way, the end of the podcast episode for you will be when you share it, although people will listen after that. But create the conditions for great work is really dangerous as a creative, because you can procrastinate and spend forever trying to create the conditions for great work. Right. You know, I'm in this new, possibly this room will be where I work from in this house. But like, you know, I could have easily got stressed out this morning about the fact that, you know, this laptop is balanced on a box, is balanced on a windowsill, right? And my mic is balanced next to it. This is not the perfect conditions for recording a podcast interview, but much, much better. Like, I could have got stressed out about that, tightened up, spoke less, or even just cancelled, because I knew I wouldn't have a desk. Really important not to do that, because much better that we're having this conversation, it's done, it goes out there, than it doesn't exist. And that's the same with all our work. So we've got to be really careful. Really, what we need to do is start, the most important conditions for great work are that we start, keep going, and share that work. Because no great work was ever made without doing that. And we've got to be really careful with the create the conditions one. So I'm still umming and ahhing about whether that should have been the 4th book instead of the 3rd one.
Yeah, no, I don't know. Well, at least you got started. Get perfect.
Yeah, exactly.
Later. So that's the next series you can read. Yeah. So eat your own words. Point. Sorry, I couldn't help that. Yeah,
no, exactly right. No, but it's exactly right. And it's so, I tell you what, for me, it's so useful to have published these books about this process, because it means whenever because I still get stuck in it. There's a quote from, I always get it slightly wrong. There's an American writer called Toni Morrison, and she said something like, if there's a book that you want to read that hasn't been written yet, you must write it. And it's not quite that I did that with these books. I didn't set out so consciously, but they're really books for me. So I use them all the time to remind myself of how to get stuff done. And you reminding me is helpful. So thank you.
Yeah. And there's two things I have to just make a mental note of, verbally here, because they've struck me so much from what you've just said so far. The first is this permission almost that if it wants to come out, it should come out and it doesn't necessarily need, it might be a book, but it might just be this conversation, and me being a fledgling podcaster, it so easily in my mind gets trampled down, and yeah, thank you for giving that, validation and permission to me and other people, listeners, to, even if it's still just half an hour a week, to find time to create an outlet for something that might want to come out. And it might not be the right thing that's coming out to start off with, but as yours, you didn't know what you were writing really, but it turned into these 4 great sections of helping people. So, and then the other one that might be more just for me was this, you said the fear of making something happen. And I didn't realize I had that fear. I know I'm fearful in various ways, but nobody's actually quite verbalized it for me it's something to say, oh, I've got that, because I can't upset anybody, can't blah, blah, blah. Oh, yes, that is so to identify that. So thank you. It's life-changing, actually. So thank you for everything so far. That, a fear of actually doing something that might have any consequence, hopefully positive, but it's I can't move house, I can't. Oh yeah, I wrap myself up in knots. I can see by that fear of, oh, this might actually make something happen.
Yeah, well, yes, it's really meaningful that you say that, and I'm really glad it had that tiny effect. I had this thought, even if that's just a tiny effect for you, I'm really glad that it had it. I had this thought last year, I think, about all this work, this 12-minute method work, that really that's, the most exciting thing, that the real success for me is to hear from somebody and they say, look, I've been meaning to do or thinking about doing this thing for a long time and I haven't done it. And now I came across your work and I've done it. Like, that's so exciting. But it can be anything. Like, some of my favorite ones that I've heard so far is like, one of the staff members at my daughter's nursery said, I've just stopped like not putting the washing away. Like, I used to just like leave it in a pile for days. And I read your book and I was just like, no, I might as well just do it now. And it's like, that feels so small, but I know for that person, that's a part of a bigger picture. And I really liked, one of my friends told me that he'd given my book or lent my book to one of his friends who had just she'd had a kitchen extension or something that they'd been meaning to do and work on for a long time, and they hadn't done anything. And now it was moving again. And it can be anything from that to writing a book or starting a business. And each time we do those things, it's like we become so you have to, here's one of the things that I think I learned from David Gemmell. So it's interesting that he came into this conversation, but I've seen to be true for me through the 12-minute practice, which is courage is just acting in the face of fear. And that's a David Gemmell quote. It's probably one of the ones on the Wisdom of David Gemmell website. I know other people have probably said it too, but that's where I learned that. And when we make acts of courage, like, the things aren't as scary the next time. It's not that they aren't scary, but over time, it's very rare for me to sit wrapped up in anxiety now about posting a 12-minute article. But it used to happen, I don't know, every one at first, and then every other one, and then 1 in 3, and then gradually it has gone down. And I think that whenever we have these things that we're not doing, and then we take action, we've kind of realized that we can do that anytime we want.
Yeah.
But the only way to do that, to kind of change ourselves in that way, I think, is to practice doing it. And so the fact that you're making this podcast is, you're practicing doing that every time you launch an episode.
Yeah, no, thank you. And one bit I went straight to in your book as a priority was, for me, this abundance of opportunities, because I can see, so using the washing analogy, I'm going to use the washing analogy, but for my I mean, before I read your term, abundance of opportunities, it's like just overwhelmed, can't pick. I would put it is more how I viewed it. But the fact you can look at them, each of these, I would almost, minefield of opportunities is the wrong term, but that's my old language of to actually say, just look at them. They can either be a spark of joy or something that you can be grateful to let go of. So both of those sound much nicer ways. So if I can start putting my pile of washing of opportunities, I'm going to use the pile of opportunities like a pile of washing. And so that's going to be good for me.
I love it. And that idea, again, thinking of people who have inspired me, like I don't know much about her work, but that spark of joy or gratitude and let go, that's from a Japanese woman called Marie Kondo.
Okay.
And she actually does, I don't know if it says it in that chapter and that's where you picked it up, but she does it about clothes. That's one of the places that she does the work on. I don't know if you've just made that yourself.
No, I didn't read the clothes bit in your book. No, I've just made that link. Okay, right.
So that's what she says. So it's like her work is mostly about literal clutter, and one of the ways to work out whether you want to keep an item of clothing or something in your house is, does it spark joy? That's one of the questions. And if not, thank it and let it go. But a great way to think about opportunities. I love that you've pulled that chapter out of the book. And I think that one of my favorite things, in fact, about having conversations about the book is because all of the books are written in the way they were written. They're all these little short chapters. And so if I speak to you, there's a bit that speaks to you and you pull out of it that's different to what I speak to, if I speak to my wife or a friend or a client. So I love that. And I think the abundance of opportunities, that overwhelm, that's one of the things that still catches me, both there are so many things I could choose to do. How do I possibly choose? And also, if we start something, often it feels like this is an overwhelming project. Like, a podcast is a good example. It's like, how will I ever, it's impossible, almost impossible not to compare ourselves to other podcasters who undoubtedly have, I don't know if you're me and maybe you're the same. I'm only comparing myself to the people who have millions of listeners. And thinking, well, my podcast will never be that big and that significant. And that was the wisdom of David Gemmell story for me as well. The key piece of coaching that I got from my friend Inga that got me going on that was, it's like, I was like, what's the point in making this? No one will read it. And also at the same time, I was like, and it's too big a project. I'll never get through it. And Inga's basically, she heard me tell the story about being 14 and 15 and it really making a huge difference to me. And she asked the killer question really, which is how many, 14 or 15-year-old boys would need to come across this through your website and be as inspired by David Gemmell as you were for it to be worth you getting through all this anxiety that you've got and starting the thing. And it's like, that's how, that's like, well, obviously it's one to me, obviously if even one person, then it would be worth me getting over myself and making the thing. And then she made it even worse. She said, because I have a 14-year-old son, it's like, oh, okay, I really have to do it now. And then I did it in a way. It was one of the first, I didn't know at the time, but it was kind of the same idea as the 12-minute method. It was, I'm going to do one a week. I'll build it weekly. Yeah. There's 1,000 quotes that I'd collected from David Gemmell's books. How am I going to get through 1,000? Well, I'm going to do it one a week.
Yeah. Well, no, thanks for that. Right. Now, I love inspiring events that dissolve barriers between people and make everybody feel on the same team, kind of team human. And one of your 4 sections is that sharing piece as well, that last book in the series. Is there any inspiring events or stories you can tell us about that you experienced that kind of spontaneously dissolved barriers and brought people together?
Yeah, what comes to mind is actually a person who could have been the answer to your first question about people that have really inspired me. So I can't remember which book it's in actually, in one of the books, there's a story about, so there's a musician called Frank Turner, and he's been a big influence on me. There's lots of reasons for that, but part of it is Yeah, but like one of the things that so let me tell two little stories about events. So the event that came to mind is I went to a gig of his. So he runs a festival often at the Roundhouse in London called Lost Evenings.
Okay.
And I went to it in September 2021. So it was the first time I'd been to a gig since the pandemic.
Yeah.
During the pandemic. And I got to tell you, it was also the first time we'd left our daughter. So she was born in the pandemic. So we left her with neighbors, got the train across London to Chalk Farm, and went to this gig. And I got to tell you, I was incredibly anxious. I was claustrophobic, actually. Like, I was quite a chilled out pandemic person in the grand scheme of things. But when I was in the queue for the bar at the Roundhouse and someone pushed in between me and the person in front of me, I had to get outside. Like, I've never been that claustrophobic, but It was just all the pandemic stuff wrapped up. And so I was in that state. And then we went into the main room and he started to play. And Frank Turner has created over many years a crowd of people who, like, there are two rules at his gigs. He says, don't be an idiot. And if you know the words, sing. And so he started with one of his songs and everybody sang. And I got to tell you, I haven't felt, it was like an incredible rush.
Oh, wow.
To be back in a room with, I can't remember the Roundhouse, 3,000-4,000 people probably singing together. And you can just kind of feel, instead of feeling anxious about the fact that it was so stark, right, compared to the pandemic anxiety, to being just like, you know, and I was lucky because I wasn't a high risk person and I didn't have anyone at home. So I was able to relax in some way around that, but also just incredible nourishment of us all singing together.
Nourishment. Wow, yeah, I like that. Using that term, nourishment, in that situation. Yeah, that's powerful.
Well, it really felt like that. It felt like, you know, when you're hungry and you eat something really, you know, not like chocolate, which is like delicious but isn't good for you. It's that same thing. It's like nice but not good. But like eating something really nutritious when you're really hungry and delicious. It felt like that, really. And then the thing that's interesting is there's a chapter in one of my books about that festival, an earlier version of it, going to it, being incredibly inspired by it, and then feeling incredibly intimidated. Because I was like, well, what's the point? I'm never going to create something that brings such a range of people together in such a joyful, friendly, amazing sense of community. Like that, there's never going to be a time when I bring that many people together. So what's the point in my work was essentially what I took from that. And then I remembered where Frank came from and how he grew his following, which was one gig at a time. You know, he was an independent musician. He just gigged and gigged and gigged. He got really good at his craft. He kept going. He kept trying to create the conditions of great work. He kept sharing. And in the end, at some point, a single made Radio 1, and then suddenly, you know, things changed. And he had a #1 album this year, which is nuts when I think about how long he's been on tour, gigging away, doing his work, inspiring people.
Yeah. I'm getting so much, because I'm very short-sighted sometimes and impatient. So, yeah, this is really helping me to believe. And
I mean, me too, right? Like, it's really hard not to be impatient and want the success soon. And part of that, I think, is we're often sold that that's how it works. Yeah. That if you launch a podcast, it will become the Tim Ferriss show straight away. Or if you have your first single, you'll straight away be the Beatles. But that wasn't how the Beatles worked, and it wasn't how most of them worked, right?
Yeah. No, it's brilliant. Right. So, and now it's time for quick fire inspiration. So these can be long or short answers. Could you tell us one of your most inspiring films?
Such a good question. I love Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Okay. I don't know if you know that one, but it's like, for people who don't, it's a Western, but it's not really. Really, it's a story about friends. Okay. Going through difficult things together.
I've heard of it, but yeah, okay, I'll have to look it up.
Yeah, great film.
One of your most inspiring comedians?
Good question as well. Like, for me, it's hard to pick out the comedian because it's mostly about the moments. So I think that comedy does carry lots of inspiration for me. But like, so for example, what I thought about then was two comedians who I saw at the Edinburgh Festival. One who's gone on to become, they were probably almost the same size at the time in terms of fame, but one who's gone on to become massive, Dara O'Brien, and one who I don't think has. a Canadian guy called Ben Bailey. And but it was like the moment was what was inspiring to me, because we were in the Edinburgh Festival and of a certain age and having a like wonderful experience. And so that's what came up there. But they're also both very funny people.
Yeah, thank you. One of your most inspiring aspects of nature?
Well, I'm kind of looking at it, Iain. So we moved into this house, and when we first came to look around, it was a nice house. Like it ticked a lot of our boxes. We thought about where we were going to move, and then we went out to this back garden, and I can just about see it from here. I'll email you a picture or something later. There's a really old oak tree in the garden here, and I thought, wow, you can't like make. I don't know how old it is. We'll need to measure it or something to work it out. But you can't just get a 500-600-year-old tree in your garden.
Yeah,
well, it's absolutely like, I'm really looking forward to working with a view of this tree. In fact, my wife's going to have a much better office in this house, partly because I really want where I'm going to work from to face this tree.
No, it's so inspiring. Thank you. Yeah. One of your most inspiring aspects of design or style?
Well, Marie Kondo's thing, it's not quite design or style, but that stands out. But let me see. So I really like, there's two artists who I like, and for some reason that's what's coming up. I'm not sure if it's quite design or style, but I'm imagining interiors and a room, and there was my old friend Amy Antoniak, and also my newer friend Alex McIntyre. They're both amazing women, amazing artists, and there's something about the way they paint these. Both of them paint slightly different, but both paint these really big, again, often nature themed, kind of, to me, quite epic paintings. And yeah, I guess that's a design, an interior design thing. I love to walk into a room and see a piece of art like that in a way, I'm not so good at this, but in a way that kind of holds your attention.
Yes.
I really like that.
Yeah, interesting. One of your most inspiring songs?
Well, I could do a Frank Turner one. We've already talked about Frank, so maybe it's one of my other favorite musicians is an American woman called Brandi Carlile. Yeah. And which of her songs? I mean, there's so many, but the one that comes up now is there's this beautiful one called "The Mother," about when she first had her first child, or they first had their first child, and when we were about to have ours, I was thinking that song came out about then, and so it taught me some great lines in it about how she, I never sleep anymore, and you trashed my car, but that was never who we are, something like that. I've butchered it a bit, so it's a real inspiration for parenthood, but also for that kind of, like Frank, she has this great ability to kind of tap into humanity for me and help me tap into mine.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. And the last one, the most inspiring aspect of travel?
Oh, well, I had never left Europe until I was in my late 20s. And I, in the middle of a kind of what we might call, one of my coaching friends, Chloe, would call a quarter life crisis, basically. But it's also we have some people, it's the Saturn returns age. So it's the time, it's that late 20s time when we often go through a transition. I left my job, and a relationship ended, and one of the things I did was I went traveling.
Okay, yeah.
And it did, for me, it is like, I saw some amazing things, but it did mean that it really felt like I could see the world better once I'd been to, the developing world, basically. And I'd been to other continents that are different to us. Like I went to Asia, basically. I went to North America too, but that was a slightly different feel. But that, and seeing people living in real poverty, but also how their lives were wonderful in some ways. That was really transformational for me.
Yeah. No, thank you for sharing all of that. So I'm afraid we're coming towards the end now. Could you tell us what you think's most right in the world?
Most right?
Yeah.
Huh. I'm I'm not sure I know, Iain. So I'm cursed, I think, to be a doubter. So my people who know the Enneagram, I'm in Enneagram type 6, which is basically it's kind of a personality profiling thing, but it's a bit more than that. Yeah. And that means that I'm cursed to be the doubter. And there's wonderful things about that, but it means that I often sit with a question like that and say, I don't know. But I guess there are two things that come up when you say that. So I think, one of my mentors, Robert Holden, he has a book called Lovability. And once you've read that book, and once I've thought about it, like it's hard to think of a situation where love isn't right.
Okay, yeah.
So that would be one. And then also, I think my feeling, the kind of thought that I've had of like this is that doing these things, these creative impulses that we have, whatever they are, all the ones we've talked about, doing them is almost always the right thing to do. I've never heard someone say, I've got this creative hell feeling about this thing, X, and that X thing doesn't make the world in some way a bit of a better place.
Yeah.
So I think, this podcast, for example, definitely does. It's like the singing that I could have done at the party would have made it at least better for me.
Yeah.
So
no, it's a nice
I think those two things are what come to mind when you ask that question. It's such a good question.
Thank you. And what's the next book on your reading list?
So it's I'm not going to remember the name. I'm doing some biographical counseling at the moment, and one of the things, there's a book called The Phases of.
You can send it me after, and I'll put it in the show notes.
I'll send it to you after. Basically, it's a book looking at the phases of development that children go through that my counselor recommended, both for me and me as a parent. And that's going to be. I want to make sure it's next on my reading list, because although I don't know where it's gone now because we've had all our stuff packed, but it'll be somewhere on my bedside table soon, again, once I've finished the one I'm reading now. And I'll send you the link. I'll send you the details so you can put it in the notes.
Thank you. And how do people get in touch with you?
So yeah, best place is robbieswale.com. But I'm also on all the social media. I'm most active on LinkedIn. So anyone who's heard me here, add me on LinkedIn and let me know that you heard me on Iain's show. And the books, they're on Amazon, but they're also on Waterstones and Blackwell's websites, places like that. So people can find them if they want to have a read too.
Brilliant. Now, thank you so much for your really, really inspiring stuff today. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Iain. It's been a total pleasure.